Welcome to this very special edition of the Author's Voice with KAJ, a show where we explore the stories behind the stories. Here we dive into the worlds created by authors, discover their inspirations, and ensure that you walk away enriched and inspired. And today we have with us author Andrea W. LeDew. She is the author of Polemics, Political Poems and Prose, a collection for those bewildered by the last decade of US politics. So, Polemics is a chronological collection turning hot button issues into poems, essays, and fiction. So, we'll learn more about it from Andrea directly. So, let's dive into the story behind the story. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me, AJ.
Welcome back to the KJ Masterclass once again, this time on the author's voice with KJ Andrea. So, straight way to understand, the book itself. But before that, let's understand the author first. What led you to become an author? Firstly, let's get into the inspiration, the inspiring story of yours to become an author.
Well, I think I've always liked to write. I remember being at a museum when I was maybe in fourth grade in Bluebirds, which is kind of a version of Girl Scouts, and I was writing a story about a squirrel, and it was very important. I think his name was Ronan. I even remember his name, and it went on for pages and pages in pencil in a spiral bound notebook. And I just remember that night because we had chocolate pudding for dessert and I spilled chocolate pudding all over the manuscript. But I kept it. So I still have it somewhere in this house. And I think it's really important with children to encourage them to express themselves, however they're going to do it. I have several children who are visually artistic and also pretty gifted with words, and I feel like that's something I always had that encouragement. My mother was a poet on her own right and had published many pieces of poetry and studied under a poet named Talia Bowie, who was at Bates College. I went to University of Florida and had an English major and had many great professors as well. Richard Ware was one of my favorites who taught world literature. And he taught me that if you dress nicely, you can do almost anything. So I have always written journals. I've always tried to express myself in poetry in some way. But when I finished my English major, I also wanted to make a living. And so I decided to apply to law school. And I got in, and I was very excited about it. But at the same time that I was in the English major program, I was also dabbling in German because I had started learning German back when I lived in Minneapolis as a young teen. And that's a very German Scandinavian area. Certainly it was at that time. So they had German all the way through high school. So I had gotten to the end of the junior high portion of German before I ever moved to Florida when I was 15. So I was only left with 1 year of German, and then I had to switch over to Latin. So anyway, my German speaking abilities were decent. And so I was tutoring during college to these small groups using the Dartmouth method, which is a lot of repetition. You say a phrase, they say it. You say a phrase, they say it. And we also went to Stammtisch every week, which was just a social hour, with beer and in the Ratskeller at the University of Florida. Before that building tragically burned down. But anyway, I really enjoyed German, and my German professor had encouraged me to apply for a scholarship. And I got the scholarship, amazingly, even though I was not a German major. And I got to go to Germany and stay in Würzburg, West Germany, during the year of 1984-85, when those were still the Reagan years. Reagan was not as popular in Europe as he was in the States. And And so I got a wonderful international experience. All the other foreigners like me, you know, who were learning to speak German all had to be in a class for maybe 4 weeks before they started school. So I met a lot of people from all over the world and really got to understand what it is to be a world citizen, to have responsibility to other nations and not just your own. And I feel like the America First, movement is a little too concentrated on our own needs and not as aware or as receptive to the needs of other nations. So after I went to Germany for a year, I did end up going to law school. It was very, very difficult for me. I was told in my property class that if you were a computer major, an engineer, an architect, any of the sciences, you were going to do great in his class. If you were a liberal arts major, forget about it. And it turned out to be absolutely true. So I did not, really absorb property law until I watched, Downton Abbey years later. That was my main tutorial in property law. Anyway, so I finished my law school degree and I followed my fiance down to South Florida from Gainesville, Florida. And we got married shortly thereafter. I worked for a collections law firm for a year. And then for about 3 years, I worked as a child support enforcement lawyer, where I mostly represented wives, but, it was just depended on who had custody. And those were very informing years. I'm happy to say I've been able to keep my marriage together all these years, but after having had that example. And then I went and followed my husband on the rest of his career. Once we started having children, I just stayed home. And I have, of course, followed the news and kept up my credits so that I can continue having a law license just in case anything happens and I need it. And of course, that's helped me with things like, being the executor for my father's will or helping my son with autism get through his special needs IEPs, his documentation, things like that, meetings with the teachers. So that's kind of the story of my life. Now I live in Jacksonville, Florida. All my children are grown. My son with autism still lives with us. He's now 26. And most of the children live here in town. So I'm very lucky in that way. I'm also active now in the writers groups that are here in Jacksonville. They had a gathering called Jacks by Jacks, which took place for many years. It didn't take place in this particular year, but I was able to read the last few years 2 of my short stories. One of them was very bawdy, very, I don't know, a little more sensual than most of my writing. And the other was also kind of a political story about a protest. And this was long before, any of the protests that we've seen in the past year.
Absolutely, absolutely, Andrea. So let's get to your book. Your book. This is the book. Polemics, political poems and prose. Wonderful, wonderful. So, Andrea, what inspired this? Normally, people either write poetry or either about politics. Both the things coming together is red. Old days, people used to, invoke those passions, emotions about patriotism through poems. But today is a different age. Help us understand what inspired your book.
Mm. Well, I tell you what, I think I first got interested in politics while I was still in undergrad. And I met this wonderful woman, and her name was Sister Hannah Daly. She was a nun, and I had grown up Catholic. During my college years, I wasn't particularly practicing, but I found that hanging around some of my high school friends, I was just goofing off too much, and I was worried I was not going to make the grade. So I ended up looking into the local Catholic social club, the Newman Club. And hanging out there, I got to meet Sister Hannah Daly, and she was doing a prison ministry in the North Florida area. So she would take, 2 or 3 young women, and we would go behind bars in the youthful offenders prison at Lancaster, or we would go to, I think I went once to Florida State Prison, which is that's where they had, they used to call it Old Sparky, which was the electric chair. And that's where they actually do death penalty executions. And, of course, we're in Florida, so that is still a thing. I've never been in favor of the death penalty, but it is something that exists in our state and many states. And I think it's a very, it's supported by both our governor and by the current administration. Anyway, we would go to all these different things, and she always encouraged us to pay attention to the news and try to take the point of view of people who have made mistakes in their lives. And some of these people who are certainly at the youthful offenders prison, 16, 17-year-old boys who had stolen a car or done something that got them into trouble. And I learned some interesting things about Florida. Florida, I come as a transplant from Minnesota. So, other than school, I didn't have that much exposure to the culture. But as I was in this program with Sister Hannah Daly, I ended up learning about things like they had comic books within the prisons that were portraying Catholic religion as following the Antichrist. So there were some very, very, strong Pentecostal or Protestant religions that were pushing this propaganda on these kids who happen to grow up Catholic, and they're like, I didn't do anything. Why do they all think I'm of the devil? And this is one of the interesting parts of living in Florida is you have this overlay of Christianity and very I don't know, not terribly intellectually, faithful beliefs. They're kind of based in the Bible or based in what people have always done. And of course, we've had segregation in this state and in every state of the union, I'm sure, but particularly in the South, it was bad. And so anyway, that's when I first got interested in politics. And I was told as an English major by my professor, Richard Ware, he said once to me, or maybe he said it to the whole class, that it's not a good idea to write poetry about politics. And that's because it's ephemeral. Of course, politics only makes sense to the people of the time. If that is your subject matter, it's going to be really hard for it to have staying power. But as history shows us, there are still lots of events that have been marked by poets throughout the years, and we still remember them. So, like, I'm thinking of the 500. I don't know if you've ever heard of that poem, but it's about a great battle, and that was commemorated. And of course, the Ride of Paul Revere. There are a lot of poems like that, and I think every poet probably dabbles in this. But I just found during the first Trump administration, that was all I could think about. It was really hard for me to focus on fiction or focus on something that I felt was less important. It just seemed like I needed to chronicle this somehow. And that's what I've tried to do. So from 2016 up until almost the present, until April of this year, right about the time that Trump announced his tariffs, all that period of time is included in my book. And It is a little light on the Biden years. Trump is much more represented than Biden, but that's because, to me anyway, it felt more normal during the Biden years. It wasn't as inspiring. There are a few things like pulling out of Afghanistan that definitely sparked my interest and made me want to commemorate it. But this year, especially, it's just been one thing after the other. And I continue to write poetry on various topics. One of my latest was about the Renee Good shooting. I don't know if you have been exposed to that news, but very big news in the United States. And Minneapolis is I spent many of my formative years there from about, I don't know, 10 till 15. I lived there and I went through many, many winters. So I'm aware of what it feels like to be in 8 degrees below Fahrenheit, weather. And and I also even remember, I'm old enough to remember, the women's movement that took place in the 70s. And I remember one of my childhood friends had a mother who would go out marching in the women's movement. My mother was not terribly political in that way, but it seems to have come full circle. It's like you had the marching of that era, and then it seemed to drop off as the yuppies came in the 80s and up until our present day. And now it's big again. I guess around there was the Me Too movement, which caused a lot of people to protest, just for the representation of victims of, sexual misconduct. But other than that, maybe the Occupy movement, but there have been sparser, smaller movements, and now it's just seems like it's just gathering steam. I certainly hope so.
Absolutely, Andrea. So, who is this book for, Andrea?
Well, I think this book is for somebody who feels a little confused about current events. So the things are happening so quickly. You barely have time to respond to one thing before you have to draw your attention towards another. And that seems very on purpose, But this book lays out chronologically, so logically, basically, the beginnings of the change that we are experiencing. So as time went on in the past 10 years in our country, people have become less and less trusting of government overall. As time went on over the past 10 years, and maybe a little before then, people have grown more divided by party. And also, more recently, people have begun to reject the idea of party. And this is also who my book is for the person who really feels outside of politics. They feel like politics only, is just a nuisance, or it doesn't matter what I think. I talked to one young man. I was tabling at a book event just a couple weeks ago, and he said something like, it doesn't matter who I vote for. The person in charge doesn't care about me. You know, they're going to do what they do no matter what. I just have to survive. That kind of message. And that just breaks my heart to think that people who are Americans who grew up in the country that I grew up in would abandon hope like that. So I tried to argue with it, it's like, but the institutions are strong, but we can save it. There are so many great things about this country, and the administration is nibbling at the edges, that's for sure. But there's nothing that can't be saved at this point. And I think people need to believe that. If they don't believe it, then, you know, I'd hate to say goodbye, United States, but that's the worst that could happen. I mean, maybe that's good for other countries, but for us, it would not be good. So,
Absolutely, Andrea. So, when you started writing this book, did you write with a optimistic frame of mind or a pessimistic frame of mind? And how did it end up? Did you still be the same way, or was it different than the way you started? How do you feel now?
yes, I think that in the beginning, it felt like kind of a clown show. It felt like, oh, this guy's just, performing. He's just making trouble to make trouble, and he's gonna get his comeuppance at some point. And as the time went on, and there were no consequences, and it seemed like, of course, at the end of the first Trump administration, Trump was in a lot of hot water, and he ended up getting impeached a couple times. And and they had all those trials, and I watched them vigilantly. I even have some poems that are about the various proceedings that took place on Capitol Hill. But in the end, there was no consequence. So it was just an opportunity to rebuild his base with a vengeance, with a sense that he and his people had been wronged. So it was like the earnestness with which the Democrats prosecuted Trump. They could have just let it go, I guess. But the earnestness kind of backfired against the Democratic Party. And then, of course, they lost the most recent election in 2024. And, part of that was Biden being aged and not performing with as much energy as Trump was. And part of it was people disliking Kamala for whatever reason, whether could have been racist, it could have been sexist, it could have been just her performance didn't match what they expected out of her president. And I have poems on those as well. So that whole transition period, I have a poem that talks about ships on a collision course. So like you think of these great big ships that the British used to have, that sailed across the ocean and carried cargo. And also, so the Spanish Armada or something like that. That's the way I think of it. It's like Biden and Trump were on a collision course, and both of them were saying, "We can save you. We'll give you the best, that America has to offer." And then it turned out that they didn't actually meet on the battlefield at all. It was somebody totally different, which, I supported Kamala, and I hope that she would win, and I'm sure she would have been a fine president, but the cards came out differently. So we are stuck with the result, and elections have consequences. So we just have to try to make sure not too much damage is done. And I feel like a lot of Americans are recognizing that damage is being done. And I hope that they will fight against that.
Absolutely. What was the most challenging part of writing this book?
Well, I think some of the essays were difficult to write. And they're even difficult to read at this point. Like you were saying, have any of your positions changed? Certainly my position on colonial or Confederate statues changed. I wrote 2 different poems that were talking about statues. Actually, I think the first one was an essay, and the second was a poem. But the first one said, oh, Confederate statues shortly after Charlottesburg, Virginia. Statutes are commemorating somebody's parents, somebody's grandparents or great grandparents. And that's a kind of family pride. And, Southern pride is very, very common in this area. But at the same time, I maybe a year or two later, I came across an article in a Flemish newspaper that talked about a statue, and it was of King Leopold of Belgium. And he was in charge of the terrible, almost genocide in the Congo, where he just worked people to death. And all these Africans were killed and harmed during that period of time. So there was a statue in Brussels that people poured red paint on and stuff like that, and eventually it came down. But there was a statue in the Congo that immediately after King Leopold left, right? He was no longer the colonial power. It was an independent power, though I couldn't tell you who was running it at the time. Immediately after that happened, that statue came down. They took it down immediately. And it went to some warehouse somewhere, and it stayed there for 50 years or more. And then in 2017, whoever was ruling the Congo, or I'm sorry, I'm probably using the wrong name for it. That's probably the colonial name. But anyway, whoever was running that country decided it would be instructional to bring that statue back so people could see this is King Leopold and he was part of the history of our country. So they brought it back. And then 24 hours later, the statue was gone. Somebody took it down. And that kind of, that's sunk in. That's a strong feeling. And you can understand, and how is slavery that much different, than what King Leopold did? So I've definitely changed my mind on that, and I understand it better. And since that time, a lot of the statues have come down in Jacksonville. There were several Confederate statues that were, revered, I guess. I don't, by some people were happy, to see them. There was a mother with two children, and she was reading to the two children, and they were, it was supposed to be a commemoration of the war dead, from the from the time of the Civil War. But the thing was, all those statues were put up in the early 1900s. They were not of the era, that the 1860s or whatever, when the Civil War took place. They were put in by the people who wanted Jim Crow. They were put in by the people who wanted to enforce a racist agenda. And even though these are relatives of some people who may still live here, we have to understand the context, and we have to be respectful of the experiences of all the people who live in, a state like Florida, which has a very large minority of Black people, as well as many, many other, ethnic minorities, including a lot of Hispanics who are having a hard time right now. So.
Absolutely. So, Andrea, in a nutshell, what is it what key message, what key insight do you want readers of your book to take away?
I would say don't give up on your country. Don't check out. Be aware. Don't be afraid to look at the news just because it's negative. There are plenty of very good things that are happening that are combating the negativity. And many of the things that happen, that the Trump regime is responsible for putting into place that are questionable legally, are being struck down in courts. And it's disturbing to see that some things are not. And there are people who are not being faithful necessarily to what we expect the law to come up with in terms of a solution. For instance, this Don Lemon case. I don't know if you're familiar with Don Lemon, a broadcaster from CNN for years and years and years. Recently, he had a scandal, and so he ended up going into the podcasting realm, which you are a part of. And he puts on a show on Substack very regularly. I watch it. I think it's great. But he was arrested for reporting inside of a church where the reverend, the priest or whatever, is a member of the ICE infrastructure somehow. So the group of protesters went into the church, and Don Lemon followed to report, and the Don Lemon was caught up in I guess there was an ICE raid that followed that took them all in. And now he's being charged with all sorts of ridiculous charges. And one of them is actually under the KKK Act, which, was supposedly to combat, white supremacist actions during, early days in the United States. And the other one is supposed to be protecting abortion clients. So people who go to abortion clinics to receive an abortion or just go there to get birth control or whatever, they were being, harassed. And there was a law that was instituted for that. And Don Lemon was also charged with something under that law. It's just how do they bend and twist these laws to suddenly apply to this novel case, And it doesn't really seem to be about trying to prove the case at all. It seems to be about embarrassing the person by arresting them. And that's just so Soviet almost. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, and I don't like to see it in my own country.
Absolutely, Andrea. So, this one book, any other book that you are working, if I understand, it draws on your experience caregiving for your adult son with disabilities.
Yes, that's right. I'm working on a novel. I have about 75,000 words written, and I'm hoping for 100,000. It's set on a garden estate, and it's a valuable piece of land in North Florida, and made up. And the owner of that land decides he wants to sell. For the past 5 years or something, he has housed a group home for people with developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities on his property. And so there's a number of people who live in the house and go about their everyday tasks, and they have various caregivers there. And, it's a functioning home for them. And then they're all confronted with this idea that you no longer have a home. And one of the problems with Florida in particular, and I'm sure there are other states and other countries that have this issue, is there's just not a lot of infrastructure for adults with disabilities. Once you get past the school system, you are, as a parent, on your own. There are of course interest groups. There's the ARC. There's lots of autism groups and things like that you can become involved in. But as far as a holding hand from the government, helping to guide you through, you really have to do a lot of that on your own. And I, happen to have a law degree, and I happen to have gone through law school, and I love to read and all that kind of stuff. So I thought that the paperwork involved was arduous. So you can imagine what people think who are, less qualified, less prepared for this. And also, what do the people think who happen to have intellectual disabilities who are trying to represent themselves? So my character is a very fiery, young woman who is determined to keep her home somehow. And so that's kind of the beginning of the story. And it goes on from there. There's a very there's a lost stained glass window that is found. There's an evil preacher. So there's several elements to it that are all kind of coming together right now. And I took a little pause to publish this book and to get it out while the issues are still very relevant. And but the other book is really enjoyable to write, and I feel like it's going to I hope it will have a good reception. I think I try to put some of the beauty of poetry into the language in the book without slowing it down too much. So we'll see how people receive it. Hopefully by the end of the year I'll have something out.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's so much to learn about all these things, especially about politics and poetry. And I'm sure a lot of people would want to connect with you, learn more about the book, buy the book. What's the best way for them to do so?
Well, if they'd like to purchase the book, the link is books to the number 2 read books2read.com/polemics. And they can go directly there. That'll take them to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever they want to go. They have all the links. If they'd like to follow me, I have a blog that's called For Random Learning Comes. That comes from my days as a homeschooler, because you have to accept that random learning is always coming to you in some way. And it's frlcnews.com. There I post about what's going on in my writing life. I put up all the podcasts I've been lucky enough to be on, like yours. And I try to also comment on the news as it goes along. And, you can find my Renee Good poem there, for example. Hopefully I'll eventually get it compiled and put out another book of poetry if Trump keeps providing me with such wonderful inspiration, which it looks like he will.
Absolutely. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The Author's Voice with KAJ. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.